right, you courageous, you curious Herle Burlyites. Welcome to the pod. We've got a great one for you today. But before we get to our guest, I want to thank you all for your recent spate of comments on Apple ratings and reviews. A few weeks ago, I desperately appealed for it, and you goddamn delivered. I want to call out this fantastic one from McLeod Clan, who writes, "This is a thoughtful and interesting podcast. I learn so much each time I listen. I particularly enjoyed the recent interview with Jennifer Welsh. And here's the kicker, and David Dodge is a fantastic interviewer. He asks the questions I want the answers to." Well, by God, thank you for that, McLeod Clan. Your comment is the first time I've ever been mistaken for a noted economist or a former governor of the Bank of Canada, or anyone with a PhD, frankly. It's a win for me, and I'm taking it. All right, on to today. We have the Honourable Perrin Beatty here with us. Today, Mr. Beatty is the President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Canada's largest national business association. Prior to joining the Chamber, he was the President and Chief Executive of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. Business has always been in his blood, and this is the part of his life we'll be largely focusing on today. But to me, he was first known as a long-serving progressive conservative MP, first elected to Parliament at the age of 22, and a minister of 7 different departments, including National Revenue, Solicitor General, and Secretary of State for External Affairs. In 2018, he was made an Officer of the Order of Canada for his contributions to the development of our nation as a political and corporate leader. So here's where we're going with this conversation today. I want to talk to him about investment versus spending in the context of Canadian current economic policy, how unaligned the parties seem to be when it comes, the political parties seem to be when it comes to business interests, what the business community thinks about some of the big issues facing our society, whether that be climate change or inequality, and something that's of great personal interest to me, why there's increasing disengagement of business people from the political life of this country. Mr. Beatty, it's a real pleasure to have you on the Herle Burly. Thanks for taking the time.
David, thanks for having me.
So I'm going to start out with a bit of a Chris Farley question for you. My first memory of you is as the youngest minister in history in the Clark government. But my first big memory...
After that, 9 months later, the youngest former minister in Canadian history.
Exactly.
I held that title for a much longer time.
Well, although Jean Lapierre probably gave you a run for it at some point. But my big memory of you was when in opposition, after the 1980 election, when you launched like a one-person crusade against the Canada Revenue Agency. And you were going across the country and holding hearings, and Canadians were all whipped up about what the CRA was doing. And you had the government on the ropes. As far as I remember, you landed the first real political blow against that new Trudeau government with that business. You had the government on the ropes. You cost them at least one minister. I think the poor fellow's name was Pierre Boussière. That was a good use of your time in opposition. Remember it?
I remember it well. It was a fascinating period to be involved there, and I was stunned. But we were on the national news every night, really as the lead item often, because every day there would be another revelation about problems of abuse within the tax department. And basically, what was happening was that the government was upending taxpayers and trying to shake every loose penny out of their pockets, and they saw Canadians as being essentially crooks in waiting. That's very different from taking the approach that the vast majority of people are honest, they're law-abiding, and given the opportunity, they'll comply willingly.
Right.
So, and what was happening as well, David, I think I'm probably getting way ahead of where you wanted to be at this point, but there had been a revolving door in the minister's office in that department. The Department of National Revenue was a post as minister. You went through on the way up or you went through on the way down, but nobody wanted to stay there. And one of the officials commented to me when I became minister that I was perhaps the first minister who actually wanted the job. And one of the things I discovered when I came to the office, you're not supposed to, as you know, you're not supposed to get the records of your predecessors. These are confidences, but in that ornate office,
just whatever you can squeeze out of the chauffeur.
That's about in that ornate office in the Gothic Connaught building where the Department of National Revenue is. If you've seen it, is across from the the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, and it's designed that if ever the taxpayers storm it, you could pour molten lead on them from the parapet. But in that office, which was very elegant, there was a bookcase, and I was going through it one day and came across a briefing book for one of my predecessors, and it said, here's how to handle question period. This was advice from the department. Said, you'll get about one question a month from in the House of Commons. If it's a question about the Income Tax Act, refer it to the Minister of Finance. If it's about a tax problem that a taxpayer has, you can't answer because of confidentiality. And so what you had was a department that was essentially running itself.
Yeah.
And it was under pressure from the Auditor General and from Treasury Board and from others about how do you maximize the take. And as a result, then, without the political control that a politician would bring to this, to say, look, there has to be balance here. And with all of that pressure, what you had was a situation where the pressure continued to grow to simply extract as much money from taxpayers as possible. And so one of the things we discovered when I got in there was that employees came to me and said, when the employee evaluations are done, whether it's as auditors or as collectors, the issue isn't how fair was the assessment that you made. It was how much was the increase in the assessment. And in the case of collectors, it was, did you get the money or not? It wasn't, how do you bring somebody into compliance? When I spoke with folks in the Ontario government, said, what's the approach that you take? They said, look, if you go in, somebody makes an honest mistake on their tax return, and you go in, you slam them. What you will guarantee is the next time that you come in, you'll be met by the world's best tax lawyers and accountants when he comes in, and he'll be looking at every possible opportunity to within the law, avoid paying taxes. What they said to me was the goal needs to be if somebody deliberately is a lawbreaker, by all means go after him. But if somebody makes an honest mistake, the goal is how do you correct that? And how do you bring people in a position where they willingly comply? Because our whole system of taxation is based on voluntary compliance. If that breaks down, you drive everybody into the underground economy and people hide their income and everybody loses. The government loses, the taxpayers lose, and public confidence in the system breaks down. We're very fortunate in Canada because most Canadians believe the system is honest. And if they're honest and law-abiding, they'll be treated that way. That had been lost when you had a department that was running itself and was under pressure to simply maximize the take.
Do you miss politics?
I'll give you the same answer as George Bush Sr. gave when he was asked that. I miss the people, and I miss many of the issues, but I don't miss everything that goes with politics. All of the partisanship and the nastiness, and it's a much tougher environment, a much more nasty one than the one that I was in when I was in Parliament. And when I was elected, hard to believe, but over 50 years ago, your member of Parliament was really carried a position in society where he or she was a figure of respect, where people believed that politicians were in there to do the right thing for their constituents. There's been such a sea change since then, where increasingly people are suspicious. They believe that the whole system is corrupt and that individual members of Parliament are in there for themselves as opposed to serving the public. I believe that perception's wrong, but it's real, and it's changed the relationship, I think, permanently, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Spent a lot of time talking about that on the show. So let's just start off now with you describing to people what it means to be the head of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, what your role is, what you're being asked to, and in the course of the answer, by the way, could you just distinguish for me the Canadian Chamber of Commerce from the Canadian Council of Chief Executives?
Sure. My very first day when I came in 2007, I was driving down from family's cottage in Muskoka to Toronto, and I stopped at Chambers on the way down to introduce myself and meet them. What somebody said to me on the first day was, if you've seen one chamber, you've seen one chamber. think all of us have a sense of, have an idea that we think we know what a Chamber of Commerce does. Everyone is different. And it reflects the geography, it reflects the size of the chamber, it reflects the board, it reflects the membership, it reflects the character of the CEO. In the case of the Canadian Chamber, we're the largest business organization in the country, the largest business association. So we represent 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trade across the country. We don't own them. So the Toronto Region Board of Trade isn't owned by us. They're a member of ours, and we serve them as opposed to the other way around. And through the network and through companies that belong to us directly, we represent about 200,000 businesses. So it's every size, every sector, every region of the country, and it really is Main Street Canada. The way in which we differ from the Business Council is the Business Council is designed deliberately to represent really the top 150 CEOs in the country of the largest businesses. In our case, we go in exactly the other direction. Yes, the country's largest businesses belong to us. We're glad to have them, and they're critical for us to support our activities. But the vast majority of our members reflect the composition of the Canadian economy. 98% of the businesses in Canada are SMEs, and most of our 200,000 members represented through the network are SMEs as well.
Right. Great. Okay, so let's get into it. What is your sort of take on the state of the Canadian economy over the medium term? I mean, in the long term, we're all dead, and I'm not really asking you whether it's better 6 months from now than today than it was 6 months ago. But in general, when you look ahead, how do you feel we're positioned?
I'm worried. I'm worried because it all comes down at the end of the day to growth. Do we have the conditions that allow economic growth? The prosperity, the well-being of every Canadian family depends upon the economic health of our country, and that means the private sector. Governments don't create wealth; they create the conditions in which businesses can be successful or not. And the challenge is that most of the recent studies that have been done looking at Canada's likely growth in the next several years show that, well, one of them showed that over the next 40 years, our rate of growth will probably be about half of that over the last 40 years. So that's one comparison. How will we do relative to how we were doing before now? Another is how are we doing relative to our competitors? Pretty good in the short term. You know, if you look at the G7, we're doing not badly in comparison with the others. But if you look at issues such as productivity, what is our gross domestic product per capita, per person? The fact is that we are lagging seriously behind our competitors, seriously behind the Americans. If we had the same GDP per capita as the Americans do, we'd be about 25% richer. You can imagine what that does both for Canadian families and for Canadian governments. So if we want to fund pensions or roads or defense or any healthcare, anything that's important to us, to have that sort of extra money would substantially improve the quality of life in Canada. Then the other measurement, David, that we need to take is where are we relative to potential? I firmly believe that we're the most fortunate country in the world. That if you look at us in terms of our natural inheritance that we have, if you look at our geography, if you look at the fact we're close to the world's wealthiest market, speak the same language, have the same system of laws, have similar products, and are incorporated into a trade agreement with them, we're exceptionally fortunate. We have a diverse society, one of the best educated societies in the world. The work ethic still applies in Canada. We have a peaceful society. We get along with each other. If you look at the opportunity that we have in Canada and you measure our performance relative to our potential, that's where I think we fall behind the most. And what we're lacking at this point from any of the political parties is a strategy to say, we are falling short of our potential. Instead of simply pointing fingers at somebody else, here's the plan to get where we should be, to ensure that our kids will have a better future than we do. The thing that we have always counted upon for every generation is that people believe that their kids would be better off than they would. And
Not anymore.
They're prepared to work. Now people are frightened about the future. They're worried about their kids, whether their kids will ever have a house. They're worried about how they'll finance their retirement and where they go from here. It needn't be that way, but we need to have a strategy, and we need to have the ability to execute them.
But that growth problem and the productivity problem that underlies it, the flat growth, low growth, that's a Western world phenomenon now, isn't it, Perrin? It's not a Canadian phenomenon. It's a Western world problem where all of these Western democracies really, until there's a new maybe AI is it, but until there's a new technological revolution, are looking at pretty stagnant growth.
Yep, but it's worse in Canada than elsewhere. And we have to ask ourselves, investment is key here. What we need is investment in three things. We need investment in people to make sure that we have we have the skills base, a 21st century workforce for a 21st century economy. We need investment in things, in machinery and equipment you can have the best trained workforce in the world, but if they're using obsolete equipment, then they're not competitive. And we need investment in ideas. And in a number of those areas, we fall short of the competition. And there's no quick and easy answer for why that is, but we underinvest in training and upskilling our workforces. We underinvest in terms of machinery and equipment relative to our competitors, and we underinvest in the private sector in terms of R&D. At the public level, public expenditures in R&D are very high relative to our competitors, but we do a truly terrible job in terms of commercializing that and turning into products that show up on shop floors and on shop shelves.
Pollination. This is a kind of an odd way to start a message about investing, eh? But stay with me, Herle Burlyites. If you're of my vintage, you'll recall tracing those detailed illustrations of flowers, labeling the stamen, stigma, and pistil, maybe snickering a little bit as you learned about fertilization and how the natural world flourishes. In 2020, when it was time to name their new $100 million social impact fund, our presenting sponsor, TELUS, couldn't have made a better choice, in my humble opinion. The TELUS Pollinator Fund for Good invests in early-stage, for-profit companies where making the world a better place is baked into their business model across four key pillars: supporting responsible agriculture, caring for our planet, transforming healthcare, and enabling inclusive communities. TELUS's role in all this? Well, there's the seed money they put into these innovative companies, but TELUS also recognizes these mission-driven, diverse company founders can use help in other important ways. So they leverage their own broad network and make key introductions that open a bunch of business doors, as well as provide world-leading technology, all to help guide these startups to maximum growth and impact. So far, it's working. Just a couple of weeks ago, the fund released its second annual impact report. It's an immensely detailed piece, detailing the nearly $40 million invested so far. Here are the broad strokes. The portfolio has now doubled to 26 companies. There's been a 155% revenue increase across all investments. 54% of portfolio companies are led by Indigenous and racialized founders, 42% are led by women, and 1.1 million lives have been impacted through improved services, products, or income. That's a hell of a lot of pollinating for good. And like a bee transferring pollen grains from one flower to another, I'll bring you a couple of interesting investment stories from the fund next time. So the impact continues to grow. To learn more, go to telus.com/pollinator. When you say we, aren't you actually talking about your members? Like, there has been criticism of the Canadian business community relative to other countries that we don't invest in productivity here. Mark Carney famously referred to dead money a number of years ago in the Canadian economy. And I know that for instance, in terms of resource extraction, we're starting to put up all kinds of roadblocks to investment. But I've had senior finance bureaucrats tell me that in terms of what they can do in the tax system and various other things, they've tapped out in terms of how they can stimulate Canadian business to invest. So what is the core problem?
I don't know that there is a core problem. I think there are a number of problems that add together. And to answer your question directly, there's lots of blame to go around. That certainly includes business. We tend in Canada to be more small C conservative in terms of taking risks than our colleagues to the south. That's a problem in terms of achieving the sort of growth that you want. There's no question that industry has underinvested relative to our competitors. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One of them may be the branch plant nature of our economy, that investment tends to be where the head office is.
Geez, I didn't expect any Walter Gordon from you, Perrin.
different from Walter Gordon's, but I think we have to be realistic about what we're facing, and I think we have to take the ideology out of it. We have to be looking for pragmatic solutions. That what is the problem? How do we fix it? And I think the first advice that I would give, both as a business person and as a recovering politico, is watch out for the guy who sells nostrums or quick fixes. These are incredibly complex issues, and they require a holistic range of solutions to be able to address. David, one of the things that I keep on asking people like Mark Carney or David Dodge, whom you mentioned earlier, or others, is we've had this succession at the government level of innovation strategy, productivity strategy, competitiveness strategy. All of them have failed over the course of the last 30 years. The fact is that our performance relative to our competitors has gotten worse. Why? And I don't think there's an easy answer on that. And I think that we have to address this with some urgency and some humility, both in recognizing the fact that none of us can just simply pick an answer off the ceiling, but it's going to require a truly Canadian effort. This is not so many of the problems that we're faced with: skills, healthcare, competitiveness. These aren't owned issues that the Parliament of Canada, if we were meeting today, could pass a bill and it'd be fixed, or that any provincial legislature could, or that any business could, or that any educational institution could do it by itself. These are societal issues that we need to take a more holistic approach in dealing with. And we're not doing that very well today. We need to bring people to the table. We need to feel a sense of common cause and have some confidence that in fact we can do something about these problems if we're willing to work together. Which brings us to one of the other issues you wanted to touch on, and that's the fragmentation of society and the polarization, which is so destructive. Perhaps we should save that till later. But one of the things that worries me is that if you talk to Canadians in the way in which we're talking today, just go sit down with them, have a cup of coffee. We agree, 90% of us, in terms of what we want to see. We want to see better lives for our kids. We want to ensure that healthcare is adequate. We want to ensure that there are opportunities. We want to ensure our streets are safe. We want to ensure that our country is sovereign and well defended and so on. Within that, there's all sorts of room to debate, well, how do you get there from here? But if there were at least some civility as a starting point and a recognition that we share common goals, and what we share most of all is the fact that we are Canadian and that we live in the most fortunate country in the world, then I think we would be making much greater progress. The problem is that a variety of forces, including the traditional centrifugal forces in our society, tear at the fabric and make that difficult to do.
Right. Well, one of the things that's divisive in this country is climate policy and energy policy. And the government seems to have, in its last budget, doubled down and created an entire industrial strategy backed by real money built around clean energy production in the country. How do you feel about that? Good idea?
But I think clearly we have to make the transition. I'm in Ottawa today. You're in Toronto, I believe.
Yeah.
Look at our windows today, and what do you see? You see smoke. If anybody says that climate change isn't happening, they're in denial. These once in a lifetime occurrences that we're seeing that are happening several times a year now should disabuse any of us of the notion that it's not happening. We can debate the ability, our ability to mitigate that and to prevent it from growing. But the simple fact is that there's a threat here. It's real. It's getting worse, and we need to act. I guess what I say to people often is, if you were putting your kids on a plane tonight, what degree of certainty would you need that the plane was going to land safely before you would do something about it? If we were bringing our kids into this world, what degree of certainty do we have to have that climate change isn't real and that it isn't getting worse and that we don't have to act now for us to complacently go back and do nothing? So starting point is that all of us have to understand that it's real. All of us have to understand that we have a role to play in terms of addressing it. All of us agree, on a target of 2050 and of great progress by 2030 and so on. The question is, how do we get there from here? The enemy of progress, in my view, is ideology. It's if people take the position that all of these things are off the table and can't be considered, we lock ourselves into a straitjacket. Or if people, for ideological or other reasons, say simply, well, I don't believe that anything's happening, or I don't believe it's important, this is potentially disastrous for us. There's a caricature of business that somehow business is rapacious. It's simply there to squeeze as much money out of Canadians as it can at any cost. And I'm still struck when I come back from Alberta and I'll talk to somebody in Ottawa, and they'll say, well, what were you talking to them about in Alberta? I'll say the environment. And you get, well, that must have been an interesting conversation, eh? And my response is, have you ever been to Alberta? And have you ever looked out a window? Have you ever seen the mountains? Have you ever noticed how Albertans live with the environment every day and how they're raising their families with an appreciation of the environment? The caricature that anybody wants to simply make money and doesn't care about the damage that's done to society or to the environment or to their kids is very unfair. And again, it destroys the middle ground that we have to find if we're going to find these solutions.
But Perrin, this is maybe where your organization's interesting. And because, I think that people don't think that about their neighbor whose kids go to school with them, who runs the local home hardware. They don't think that about that business person. They do think that about Galen Weston and the cadre of super business people who are making more money than anybody ever made before in generations in Canada, and seem to be part of some different world now than other Canadians live in, and seem disengaged from Canada. So, that's sort of why I think that the business, the Council of Chief Executives, they're speaking for people that people aren't that interested in. But you speak for small and medium-sized businesses, and I think people have more confidence that those people are Canadians and are committed and are living lives similar to ours and are committed to a future for our communities.
David, that is the perception, and you talk to politicians. Small business is good, big business is bad, and the next election is apt to be fought on that basis, with who can stand up for the public against big business and put them in their place. That's good politics, but it's not right. And I meet constantly with the most senior members of the business community, and they believe deeply, and they have internalized in their companies a belief that climate change is real and that they have to respond to it and do their part. And let me single out the one that's cited most, and that's the oil and gas sector. Go talk to the senior leaders there and look at the money that it's not simply under duress that they're putting money into constantly improving environmental standards. They've internalized it. It's part of the culture. They believe in it. They are committed to it, and they're putting their money where their mouths are. I have no time for business people or for anybody else who are essentially hypocrites who you see all sorts of businesses that will be selling green products, but at the end of the day, what many of them are doing is saying, we want you to buy more stuff.
Yeah.
That's different. If you're using green simply as the wrapper on the old package, then this doesn't advance where we're going. But companies and individuals who believe that climate change is real and that all of us have an obligation to do what we can to try to address that are very different from that. And it's as varied as human beings are, obviously, the degree of commitment. But I genuinely am struck by the sincerity on the part of senior business leaders in Canada and their belief that this is an existential issue, and it's one where they have a responsibility to provide leadership. Is their PR what it should be? Clearly not, for the reasons you were citing. The public perception isn't that way, but that's an instance where I believe the perception's wrong.
So last week, Transport Minister Omar Al-Gabra, a recent guest on this pod, was at a G7 meeting in Japan talking about, yes, supply chains. If it sounds like everybody is focused on supply chains nowadays, that's because they are. Supply chains keep us supplied, and in the past few years, they've developed sclerosis. Stuff is less available. Climate change, the pandemic, and Russia's attack on Ukraine are most to blame, but not solely. Anyway, the G7 ministers were seized with the topic, as summit organizers like to say. Canada advanced two ideas for rebuilding supply chains better: increased coordination by players and the establishment of so-called green corridors between Canada, Japan, and Britain. Our sponsor, CN, would like to offer applause. CN has long argued that the sort of coordination and collaboration Minister Al-Gabra was promoting is the only way to make our supply chains more fluid and to brace them against major disruptions like wars and disease. The key is data. I've said this before. Every player in the chain must contribute. CN already makes a massive volume of its data available. If shippers, truckers, producers, maritime companies, and governments were all as transparent, we would be much closer to clear, smooth supply chains. Any policy not anchored in data is just aspirational, or a guess. Data allows for fact-based decision-making and elimination of inefficiencies. The other important piece is sensible, stable regulation. Governments should help supply chain players cooperate, not tell them how to perform. They already know how to do their jobs. As for green corridors, well, hurrah! Rail uses far less energy to move cargo than trucks or airplanes, and CN has relentlessly lowered its emissions in recent years. It was nice to hear the G7 leaders unanimously recognize that in their official declaration. It was couched in the usual obscure diplomatese, but basically they declared that railways are environmentally friendly, efficient, and really the future of transportation. Hear, hear, honourable members. So I just got to stop and say I'm really surprised by the tone of this conversation. And I probably shouldn't be because it's your tone. But when I talk to business people one-on-one, especially if somebody's had a drink, they are white-hot angry at this current federal government. And they think it doesn't understand business, doesn't care about wealth creation, doesn't care about growth. And when they find out who I am, they just yell at me.
Well, it's therapeutic. There's an enormous amount of frustration. And it's, yes, with the current government, but with politics in general as well. I think you're concerned, as I am, about the challenge of attracting good people to go into politics. And I've had, who would I like to see? I would like to see people who've been successful in their own careers, including many more business people than we have today, saying, look, I've been fortunate to be in this country and to be able to be successful. I want to put something back in. And I have friends, some of them have been on my board, who I've just found top notch, who've come to me and said, look, I'm 50. I've made my nest egg. I've done well. I'm interested in public policy. I would like to serve the country and put something back in. Tell me about a career in politics. And I am ashamed to say that there's certainly been instances where I've said to them, David, as a citizen, I would be delighted to see you run. I think you'd be a jewel in Parliament for whatever political party you ran for. But as a friend, I'm not sure I can advise you to do it. Let's look at the value proposition for successful people today. Take somebody who is a business person who is 55, kids are pretty well through school and they're getting independent. They've been successful. They have they have a bank account that they can draw on. That money isn't what motivates them at this point, and they would see it as fulfilling to be able to do something for their country. Well, what's the value proposition for them? Too often it's this: David, I'd like you to take a substantial cut in pay so that you can work harder than you did when you were in business. Admittedly, you'll be away from your family most of the time. If you still have younger kids, you may not be there for the school play or the soccer game or the parent-teacher meeting, but maybe your spouse will be able to raise the kids anyway. And you'll go to Ottawa if you're successful, and you may come out with your reputation intact, but that's less likely than it used to be, but it's possible. And you could even be in cabinet and running a portfolio, and then discover that in fact the decisions are made in the Prime Minister's office or in the leader's office if you're in opposition, and that in fact you're a bit player. You're on a short leash. That's not a terribly appealing value proposition to put to people, to say, make the sacrifice for your country. And so for so many of them, they say, well, there are other ways in which I can contribute. I can contribute as a volunteer. I can contribute as a donor. I can contribute through my business or through perhaps becoming an educator, lecturing at a university or whatever. And increasingly, unfortunately, the very people we would like to see are the ones who increasingly are turning away because, not because the pay isn't good enough for them to run, but because the other penalties they have to pay for the privilege of serving in public office have become so high. Who's to blame for that? Starting point is... Are
you thinking of an example when you say that?
Oh, yeah. No, I'm not citing an example, David, but I think of many examples when I think of that.
Okay, but let me give you an example. Okay?
Sure.
Part of it's arrogance. Like, if you're going to look at Bill Morneau, I'll just say this about Bill, who, in my experience, is a super nice guy and undoubtedly very, very smart.
And politics motivated for the right reason.
So this is not about trashing Bill Morneau as a person, but this is about saying that politics is a profession in and of itself. It is a skill. You have to learn it. And you can't just walk in one day and be the finance minister of the country without having spent any time in politics in your life and or any apprenticeship on the backbenches and expect to be good at that. And, the people who've been good at it, whether it's Brian Mulroney or Paul Martin or anybody else we can name that came from business, they took politics seriously. They didn't assume that because what they'd done in business meant they could just swan into politics. They took the craft of it seriously.
I agree. I think we're agreeing too much on this podcast so far. But I agree. And one of the things that I watched over the years in my time in Parliament was the big names, the star candidates who burnt up on entry into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. who figured, well, I'm a big and important person, and the country is so lucky to have me here. Could have been business leaders, but it could have been from any other profession as well. And they felt a sense of entitlement that this should be given to me because I'm such a super person, and isn't the public lucky? And then you would watch somebody you'd never heard of before, who the party didn't want to get nominated, who's won the nomination, and who works like crazy to get in, and who just feels privileged to be able to serve the country and to serve his or her constituency. And there's a lesson in that. That's precisely the one that you mentioned, and that's that politics is unique. It's not the same as anything else, and it requires skills that are different. Peter Bodden was my desk mate in Parliament and became a close friend. Peter was a self-made, very successful business person. He moved from Ontario to Alberta, developed a drilling company, had a charter jet business as well, very successful. And he stunned me one day when said to me, "I've decided not to run in the next election." I said, "Well, Peter, why would that be? You've got so much to offer." He said, "Because I misunderstood when I got in. I watched in that time Bob Stanfield and Pierre Trudeau, and I thought I wouldn't hire either of them to run one of my businesses. And this is the most important business in the country. I could do a better job than them, and I'm going to run for government and run it as a chief executive should." He said, "I've realized that it's a totally different skill set that we're dealing with, and that it's not all portable, and that my skills are business as opposed to politics." That's quite a sense of self-awareness that he had, that he was able to stand back and do that. So I certainly agree with you that any business leader or any other star, whether it's an academic or an entertainer or anything else, who says, "That's it, I'm successful in my profession, so that means that I'm going to be automatically successful in politics," is dead wrong. And so often we get surprised by people. Look at Zelensky in Ukraine.
Right.
Guy was an actor in an okay comedy. Who would have imagined this would be a brilliant war leader with such incredible bravery as he's shown? And so very often you're surprised. That's one of the great things about politics, that you would have found in the same way as I did. So very often you discover things about people and skills and qualities that they didn't even know that they had, that make them exceptional politicians. Harry Truman was a haberdasher. Yet he was a very remarkable president. And so politics is different. Not everybody's cut out for it. But having said all of that, do I believe that somebody who's been successful in business can bring something to government that is desperately needed in government as we look at policy solutions? You bet I do, and I'd like to see many more of them in business. And that's why I feel guilty anytime that I say to a friend, "Yeah, I would love to see you there as a citizen, but as a friend, I'm just not sure that I can honestly ask you to do it because the price you pay is so high."
I really see a growing divide.
Sorry?
I really see a growing divide. There are no business people involved in politics, not in the Liberal Party, not in the Conservative Party. And they're not just not running. Like, they're not, when I used to go to Liberal conventions, there'd be business people involved in the party, and now they're not, by and large.
Well, and we're paying a price for that, put it in the simplest terms. And let's go back to Bill Morneau for a minute. In some ways, I was his nemesis. I caused him a good deal of grief when he was proposing the tax changes for all businesses. We opposed it on main streets right across Canada. And the issue, and I spoke to him privately as well, the early stages and throughout, it was never malice on his part. It was never.
It's a rookie minister mistake, isn't it?
I think there are a number of things. Was he well served by staff? one of the things that your staff should do is to be able to say to you, you open this bag and a bunch of snakes will jump out and bite you. I think the proposals he was making there had been hanging around the department for a long time. And with a new minister, with the government saying, well, we made a commitment at election time, we were going to crack down on these people who are playing fast and loose with taxes. So the department was quite ready to say, "Oh, Minister, we just happened in the drawer here to have a plan that you can use." But when we talk about Bill himself, this is somebody I admire, whose motivations were right, who was a highly intelligent person, who was not in it to benefit himself, who unfortunately, had a rough ride through all of that. And yes, I think he would have benefited by having been in Parliament for a few years before being thrust into the post of Minister of Finance. The fact is that I don't have to tell you that politics is political. If you are a minister in anything, you're not deputy minister. You're not saying this is the best policy. You're saying, what is the best doable policy that we can have, and how do we get there from here? And that requires political skills, and political skills that for some people are innate, but for the vast majority of us, we acquire through practice.
All right. So let's assume that the Prime Minister hears my pleas to replace Chrystia Freeland and chooses me to be the new Finance Minister. And I want to do something.
Let me just get my passport to
exactly
to make sure it's in check.
Well, you know what? It's going to get to that level. So you just wait for it. But let's say that I want to do something that is going to goose growth in this country, and that the business community will respond to positively. Let's say I want to rebuild business confidence in the country. What's the thing I do?
Well, I'll tell you the same things I tell Chrystia Freeland, and the advice we give is the same in public as it is in private. First, there should be a Hippocratic oath for politicians. First, do no harm. Cool it with and I'm not referring to Chrystia here, but to all politicians, cool it with the anti-business rhetoric. We desperately need investment in this country, both domestic and international investment. If the approach that we take is, oh, you've been successful, how do we punish you? Or we think you're venal, or we don't trust anybody in business, or you're a big business, let's whack you. Then money flows across borders like light through glass. It will go where it's wanted. If the message from Canada is, we don't want you, there are plenty of places that desperately want you, and you're going to go there. So that's the first thing. Two, treat business not as a problem. So very often, the rhetoric that we hear from Ottawa is business is the problem here. It's in the way. We were talking earlier about, is business the problem in climate change? If we're going to be successful in dealing with climate change, business better be seen as a partner, and better be bought into it, and we better be working shoulder to shoulder on it. Treat business as a partner. What I've said to Chrystia is, I don't think businesses are looking for the government to write big checks. Now, the response to the American so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is an industrial strategy, we'll set that aside because it's a game changer. It's sui generis in itself. But in principle, the government realized, the business recognized the government's broke. It doesn't have drawers full of cash. It's running a deficit.
Right.
And they're not asking for all sorts of checks to be written. What they're looking for is, how do we take the encumbrances out of the way? First, take down the rhetoric. Be genuinely consultative. Not we're calling up to tell you what we're going to be doing to you, but we want to.
Do you not find the government genuinely consultative with you?
I want to choose my words carefully to make sure that I'm accurate when I say there's a lot of outreach, and I like a lot of the ministers that I deal with, and they're genuine, and I find many of them good listeners as well. And we can go through the list, and I think we'd probably agree on who they were. But do I find that the government as a whole sees business as a partner? No, sadly. And it's a refrain you hear from throughout the business community, the feeling that when you call Ottawa, there's nobody on the other end of the phone, and that much more needs to be done to have a genuine sense of partnership. It's not partnership if you're calling up a business and saying, just wanting to give you 24 hours notice of the announcement we'll be making about you tomorrow. It's a partnership if you say, how do we work together? We've got a problem. We need your help in solving this problem. How do we work together to resolve it? And it has to be genuine. So there has to be a willingness to share power. And I don't think that's the first inclination among politicians these days, unfortunately.
Right.
But going back to how do we change it? Have something that's truly consultative. Then we have to look at other areas. What can government do? It can reform the regulatory system. By that, I don't mean do away with environmental protections, but have a science-based process that is timely, that doesn't drag on over the horizon, and where at the end of the day, the decision will be made on merits, it'll be made on a timely basis, and if the answer is yes, that it will stick, and you don't have to relitigate it in the political sphere afterward. Going back to Bill Morneau's time as minister, we're all the proud owners of a pipeline. And I don't know anybody who wanted the federal government to own a pipeline. I don't know whether you were looking for that. I wasn't. I don't think Bill Morneau wanted to spend the money to buy it.
When they've come back to me for the extra cash as the cost increases, I've been reluctant.
Well, I think the vast majority of Canadians were reluctant. Nobody was calling for that.
No.
And it is the owners of the pipeline weren't looking for a check from the government. They were looking for a yes. And when that didn't come, they were prepared to write off their investment and to move out of Canada, where they go somewhere else where they could actually do business. As a result, because the government recognized that this was so important to the public interest, Mr. Morneau was forced with taking the least bad solution, which was writing a check drawn on the public treasury. Right. What we have so often with major capital projects, with major public works projects, not public works projects, but major building projects of one sort or another, is decision by delay. It just drags on over the horizon. Costs continue to escalate. It becomes unfeasible, and people walk away from it.
What causes those delays? Do you have any idea?
It's a totally sclerotic regulatory system where the focus. One of the things I've learned since leaving government is the big cultural difference between business and government. Government focuses on process. Business focuses on results. It's so process for businesses. Well, how do we get there from here, and how can we do it as efficaciously as possible? In the case of government, is have the consultations taken place? Have we struck a committee on this? Have there been hearings of all of the groups that would like to be heard being heard on this? Is there an appeal procedure? Whatever, and it grinds through. In today's economy, speed is a critical factor. We had a discussion of this at our board the other day, and one of our directors who used to work for a Chinese company, said that when he was in China, one of the business people he was talking to said to him, "We were actually in China following the process that Canada followed in the 1950s. Back in the 1950s, you built infrastructure in anticipation of growth. Infrastructure was what drove growth and what was there to accommodate it. What's happened now in Canada is infrastructure is trying to catch up with the growth. So as our capacity becomes strained, as the Port of Vancouver becomes strained, then after 10 years of deliberation, Roberts Bank 2 terminal gets approved. And over the last...
If they come, we will build it.
Yep.
Yeah.
After they've been here for some considerable period of time, or whether they should move out. So over the last several decades, instead of investing in infrastructure, we've been spending infrastructure. The fact that we've seen a degradation in many instances. One of your anchor sponsors is CN, who are key members of ours as well. The important thing about the railroads, we tend to look at companies and say, well, how many people do they employ directly? That's important. But the important thing about the railroads or the ports or the airports or the roads that we have, the bridges and so on, is as drivers of economic activity. It's the telecom system. It's not the number of people employed in telecom. It's what telecom enables us to do as an enabler. And what's key is for government to understand that infrastructure is a driver of economic activity and should predate that activity as opposed to being dragged along.
Didn't this government come to office with a commitment to spend a lot of money on infrastructure and then didn't have a big infrastructure program?
I think all do. And the other problem is we don't have a coherent strategy. And do I see any of the political parties proposing one? Maybe they are. I just haven't noticed.
I think Trudeau left it up to the provinces to basically, didn't it, to decide where the infrastructure money went?
Well, and we need to have a national strategy in collaboration with the provinces. How do you build a national transportation system or a national pipeline system or a national electricity system or a national shipping system where there isn't some overarching vision that comes into it? Your airport system, the role that your ports, you have to take a much more holistic view. The provinces have to be treated as partners. But what we've tended to do is to take an isolated problem, write a check and throw some money at that, as opposed to saying, here's our vision of where we want to go. So let's take a look at trade, for example, where we're not performing. We fancy ourselves as great global traders in Canada. In fact, so much of the trading that we do is Canada-US and is intermestic between head office of company and a plant in Canada. So take a look at the Asia Pacific, which is a priority for all of us. Why wouldn't we set a target for ourselves of the percentage of trade between North America and the Asia Pacific that would go through Canadian ports? Not a target that says, what is next year going to look like? It's going to look like this year plus 2%. But rather, here's a figure that you can't get there from here, that doing things the way we're doing them today won't allow us to achieve it, something that's truly ambitious. And then you work back from the target and you say, well, if we were to achieve that target, what would we need to do? Well, we would need to invest in our ports. We would have to have labor peace. We would have to ensure that the rail lines and other means of transport feeding the ports and coming back from the ports were functioning well. We'd have to ensure that we had a border that was functioning well. If something was crossing it to Chicago, then we'd have to ensure that the border was as seamless as possible. Look at the elements that are necessary to achieve much more ambitious plans than we have today and systematically put them in place. Instead, we tend to do it the other way and say, well, we've got some extra money here, we'll throw it at this problem. And worse, we are still looking at it in terms of what are the immediate job benefits that come from construction of whatever the project is. So, and also what are the immediate political benefits that come from putting a sign out front? So fixing the roof of the arena is more important than fixing a bridge 100 miles away, because it's seen in the community and drives votes. We spread infrastructure money like peanut butter on bread, and all of us are guilty because we look in our community and we say, what about our fair share of this money? Fair share? What we're dealing with now is triage. We don't have enough money in Canada to create the amount of infrastructure that we need. So we're going to have to set priorities. What should the priorities be based on? They should be based on what investments will bring us a return, the greatest return. If we're looking essentially at economic investments, it's how do we promote trade in the country and stimulate economic growth? What are the areas? And so the best thing for my old constituency in rural Ontario might very well be a crossing at Niagara or the Gordie Howe Bridge or whatever, or improving rail. And there could be enormous benefits there. An investment in the Port of Vancouver drives the economy of the province, of the Western provinces. It's critical for grain shippers and for potash shippers in Saskatchewan. So if we take a very narrow view about, well, it has to be right here.
You're still good at politics. Look at you. Look at you with a Saskatchewan reference there.
Well, I did know that you were. But you understand that the economy of Saskatchewan depends upon that Port of Vancouver functioning well, and it depends on CN and CP being able to move the product well. So these are the areas when you talk about, well, how can we achieve growth? Yes, there has to be some public spending there, but redirected from other areas to do it. What I'm not looking for is massive new checks from government to be given to businesses or massive across-the-board tax cuts.
I'm sorry. As you were talking, I was going to have to say, can you apply your test to Volkswagen and Stellantis? And how do they fare?
Yeah, because I have my caveat that I put in the front end, which is the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. Yeah. I wish it didn't exist. And politicians in both Canada and the United States say this is the greatest thing ever happened to Canada. Aren't you fortunate? When I talk to businesses, what they say is there is this massive magnet for investment in the United States drawn on the bank account of the American taxpayer that's designed to draw an investment from around the world. And I talk to the Europeans about it, and they are very concerned about this. So we are getting into bidding wars. The federal government had no choice but to respond. I don't like it. I do not like, in principle, using tax dollars to subsidize businesses if we can avoid doing it. But we also have to live in the world as it is. And in the world in which we live today, there's massive competition with checks drawn on taxpayers' bank accounts to attract business that we would like to have in Canada. And you either respond to that or the business is gone. So that's the concern. But your follow-up question, David, could very well be, how deep are the government's reserves? How big is the taxpayer's bank account here to write these? If we're dealing with a competition with the U.S. Treasury, these are very deep pockets we're talking about there. And I would far sooner see us find a resolution where businesses are coming back to making their decision based on rational decision about, what can be offered here? What's the quality of the workforce? How close am I to market? Is there decent infrastructure here? Is taxation fair and competitive as opposed to, is there a bidding war? And then allow investors to make their own decisions on that. Given a level playing field, I believe Canada's highly competitive.
Right. Okay. Well, one last thing, if I could. So, and it goes.
Josh Gray warned me that what gets you in trouble is always the last question. So
yeah, this is not. It's about trust. It's about your role, perhaps leading this organization, and polling organizations that measure public trust in various institutions have found dramatic declines in recent decades for all of the institutions of our society, business included. And business leaders included. I remember days when the business community's opinion about a public policy would shape public opinion about that policy. When the business community said the 1981 McKechnie budget was a bag of shit, Canadians said, yeah, I guess it is a bag of shit. When the business community told Canadians that they should support free trade in the 1988 election, that had a big impact. When Kathleen Wynne raised the minimum wage in Ontario, and Ontario business reacted very negatively to that, nobody cared what they thought. Nobody thought that they were representing a fair point of view. People thought, special interest group, of course they don't want to pay more money. What would you expect them to say? And to me, that's just one indication of the fact that, and I don't say this is a good thing, because I think businesses are the engine of growth, but I don't think that business is a trusted voice on public policy anymore, because it is seen to be almost exclusively self-interested in its interventions in the public discourse. And is there anything that can be done about that?
Yes, there is. And let's go back to your premise. Your premise relates to perception of business. I have a different perception from where I am, because I'm dealing with people in the circumstances you were talking about earlier, where you're sitting down with them over a cup of coffee, and where there are no defenses that are up, and people are very, very candid. These are people I'm proud to be associated with, who have a true sense, who are proud of their country, have a true sense of personal responsibility, and feel a sense of corporate responsibility, and who want to be able to provide leadership, both in terms of the example they set, but also in terms of the advice that they can give. It comes back to what you and I have both talked about a little bit earlier, and that's the atomization of society and the distrust that's growing. If it's a consolation to business, and it shouldn't be much of one, the respect for business has fallen less dramatically than respect for politicians and for others. But that's pretty sorry consolation to find, and it works against the public interest. I'd like very much to go back to the day where our starting point, David, is we all believe in the same goals. We all want the same things, and all of us, all Canadians, are basically decent and want to be constructive. And our starting point should be trust of one another. We should be surprised if somebody violates the public trust. That includes politicians. Instead, we've moved to a mentality of suspicion of each other, of every profession, every industry, of politics. And it destroys that public consensus that is so important for us to be able to solve problems and to achieve our potential as a country. Now, your obvious question is, how do we restore that? I wish I could tell you that there was some sort of a quick fix on this. And I'm very worried, I'm particularly worried as a citizen and as an ex-politician by the political polarization in Canada, by the destruction of the middle, and by the lack of respect that we show for each other as citizens.
I think you and I are charter members of the Mushy Middle Club, but yeah.
That's probably right. I'm very concerned about it because it tears at the national fabric of the country itself. But if we could look at it and say, this is a uniquely Canadian problem, then we could look at some other countries and say, well, how do the French deal with this? Or how do the Brits deal with it? Or the Germans or the Americans? What we're seeing, unfortunately, is endemic to the Western democracies.
Right.
And which means that it's not susceptible to some sort of quick national fix. It's not a uniquely Canadian problem. There are manifestations or aspects of it that are Canadian. But the problem is much bigger, with the sense of alienation. People look for scapegoats. Well, it's social media, or it's foreign interference or whatever. It's far more complex than that, and I don't think we've figured out the answer to this as yet. The starting point, I would say, is to anybody who's in a position of leadership, starting with our politicians, act in the way that you would like to be believed. And I often say to my friends in politics, if you keep on saying to the public that everybody who's in politics is venal, that they all have their price, that their motivation is always the worst, that they can't be trusted, don't be surprised if the public believes you.
Right.
When there's a case of food poisoning at Burger King, McDonald's doesn't run ads because it scares people off hamburgers altogether. Politicians should recognize, and there was a day when members of parliament felt they were members of a very special club, if you like. The last great so-called House of Commons man that I can remember is John Turner.
Yeah. This
was somebody who felt so incredibly privileged to be able to serve his country and to be a member of parliament. He believed in the institution, and he believed that part of his job was to bring respect for the institution and to enhance it. There was a day when there were things that politicians wouldn't do because it would damage the institution itself. There was a day when politicians took personal responsibility. Today, if something goes wrong, try finding a politician and say, "Well, that's on me."
Well, it's a bit of a parlor game in Ottawa right now.
To be a bit euphemistic about it, blame rolls downhill. I was misled by my staff or by my public servants or somebody else. But there was I knew Lord Carrington, Peter Carrington, who'd been British foreign minister. And Carrington had advised Margaret Thatcher, that he was defense minister, I guess, at the time. He'd advised Margaret Thatcher that he didn't believe the Argentinians would invade the Falklands. They did. And Carrington resigned on principle from the cabinet over the opposition of Margaret Thatcher, the prime minister.
He had failed her. He'd given her bad advice.
She did not want him to go. He said, "I gave the wrong advice. I am responsible. It is a matter of honor and integrity that I step down." That's what I always understood ministerial accountability to mean. Not, what I'm accountable to find somebody to blame.
Exactly.
Or, gosh, my defense is ignorance. I didn't know anything about it.
Could I just flip this back to business for 1 second, Perrin, and put a proposition to you for your reaction? What if business occasionally said something counterintuitive publicly that would make people feel more like you shared some of the same concerns that they do? So, I mean, if I follow politics news pretty closely, and if you have an opinion about income inequality, I don't know it.
Me? I'm glad to share it with you if you like. How much time do you have?
Well, I mean, your position as head of the Chamber of Commerce, and it isn't an attack on you. What I'm saying is I don't hear anything other than objections to things they don't like. I don't hear an intervention in the broad debate of the country.
I think you may be looking for the wrong thing. If you're saying, how do we punish people or hold people down? Nope, you're not going to hear that from us, but just the opposite. But if you hear, how do we create opportunity for Canadians? How do we put a floor underneath the weakest and the poorest in our society? And how do we create a springboard to enable them to advance? You'll hear lots of that from us. That's why we talk about the importance of investment in upskilling the skills of our workforce and training in the first place. It's why we talk about equity in the workforce and about diversity. And we spend a lot of time working on that at the Canadian Chamber, and we try to set an example in our own hiring within the institution itself. And we put on seminars on it for businesses and for chambers across the country. David, and perhaps this would be a topic for another podcast, because I would be apt to go on too long today. But
you're welcome to come back.
What worries me is that part of the Canadian political culture is that we're more concerned that somebody may get ahead than that somebody falls behind. And our focus in this country needs to be, how do we enable, as opposed to how do we prevent? The political rhetoric, I'm gesturing through the window here at the Parliament buildings, is greedflation. How do we punish? How do we haul people in and embarrass them and so on, as opposed to, which drives out investment. People say, you don't like us, we're not welcome, we'll go somewhere else, as opposed to, what can we do working together to create opportunities for people? First of all, to take away barriers. If there are systemic or statutory barriers to people's ability to rise. We need to remove that. Women are a classic case in point where they've dealt with that glass ceiling for so long. Some of that you can legislate, but some of it is on us in business to change our practices and to ensure that we remove that and that we facilitate people's ability to rise within the institution. If that's what you're referring to when you talk about inequality, we are very much on top of that. And
what I'm referring to, Perrin, is the fact that we almost have a full employment economy right now. Never had lower unemployment in my lifetime than we have in this economy right now, and yet most people feel they're worse off today than they were 2 years ago, and that
as many of them are.
And that the head of the Toronto Daily Bread Food Bank tells me that they have hundreds of thousands of people coming to the food bank who have full-time jobs. And so we're now in a situation where you can have a full-time job in this country and still need to go to a food bank to feed your family. And there's something wrong with that.
Yep. And David, it brings us right back to where we began on the issue of growth. When our growth taking place in Canada is coming from new people coming into Canada as opposed to growth per capita, that you and I are more productive, that incomes are rising and that the national income is rising, then there's something fundamentally wrong. And we are going to see those problems continuing to grow unless we address that fundamental. So very often the programs that we have are smoke and mirrors. They are not addressing that fundamental question of how do we have genuine growth in our economy. If businesses are growing, they can hire and they can improve salaries. If they're not, they can't. If the economy is growing, governments will have the money that they need to pay for programs or for infrastructure. If they're not, we will simply drive the country into greater debt. And the politicians are focusing in the wrong place. If you know of a political party that says the fundamental question is, how do we restore growth for Canadians? And here's the plan, please let me know.
Right.
And that's what's desperately needed. I believe that there is an incredible hunger in this country for vision and for leadership. People, what we learned from the 1988 election on free trade, which you mentioned earlier, and it was probably the last election where it was really fought on one fundamental issue that everybody understood. What we learned is,
unless you include the sponsorship scandal,
I'm not sure that's a policy issue. But you know, in Ontario, there was great misgiving within the business community about what the impact of free trade would be, about whether we could compete with the Americans. And public opinion polls were showing that this wasn't something where there was massive public support, government-led. And at the end of the day, what I saw from the public was they said, at least the government has a plan and it's optimistic, and they say that the country can be better if we do this. Let's take the chance. What was interesting to me was that support for free trade, if you look at business communities, was, I believe, stronger in Quebec than it was in Ontario, and which is totally counterintuitive, because you would say, well, why wouldn't Ontario, where we speak the same language as people in the States do and where we are very familiar with them, why wouldn't we say, let me at it? Instead, there was the concern that the Americans are more sophisticated or better financed or just better resourced to compete, and we couldn't do it. In Quebec, you saw people, many of whom didn't speak English, saying, this is incredibly rich market, let me at it. And this was amazing, and it's something that the rest of us could be learning from. But I believe that Canadians have enormous faith in their country. I believe that they feel enormously privileged to live here. One of the best tests for any country is which direction people are crossing the borders. And the answer is the world wants to come to Canada, not Canada. The Canadians want to leave to go somewhere else. So there is that sense of the potential of this country. It goes back to where we were before. Who among our political leaders is willing and able to put a picture in the window of what we could be as a nation, if only we were willing to work together to achieve it. And I believe there'd be enormous public support for that.
Well, let's end on that clarion call, because it's a good one. I've loved this conversation. Thank you for your time. A little bit more than I asked you for. So thanks for staying on.
Political habits die hard. I'm sorry.
No, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for your patience with me. So thank you so much for doing this, Mr. Beatty. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, all of those of you who watched or listened today, and of course, Mr. Beatty again. And we'll see you next week with more of the Herle Burly. In the meantime, take care of yourselves.
Thanks, David.